Diamond and Jenard were more than just street bosses, they were symbols of power and control. Every corner they walked, every deal they made, carried the weight of fear and respect. The city knew them, and people whispered their names as if speaking them out loud could summon trouble. Diamond, the strategist, was calm and calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Every move he made was precise. From planning his illegal trades to knowing exactly who to trust and who to keep at arm's length. Jenard, on the other hand, was the muscle with a sharp mind hidden beneath his tough exterior. He could intimidate anyone, but he also understood when to step back and wait, letting situations unfold in his favor. Together, they were unstoppable, their partnership unshakable, and their influence spreading deeper into the city with every passing day. Over the past episodes, their empire had grown beyond the streets. They moved from small-time hustlers to major players, controlling deals that involved money, drugs, and even political favors. Every person who tried to cross them ended up either joining their side or disappearing into the shadows, never to be seen again. Their enemies were many, but their power and intelligence kept them ahead. They always seemed one step ahead of the law, untouchable in the eyes of the city. Every deal, every handshake was a carefully orchestrated move in a game only they fully understood. They had a network of people who handled their operations, ensuring that nothing ever reached the wrong ears. No one could infiltrate their circle easily, and every betrayal was met with swift consequences. Despite their dominance, cracks were beginning to appear. Diamond had started to notice tension in the corners of his empire, whispers of disloyalty that he couldn't immediately identify. Even Jenard, with his sharp instincts, sensed that something was changing, that the streets were no longer entirely predictable. They had grown confident, maybe too confident, thinking that the CBI, the organization that had always been a distant threat, would never reach them. Their arrogance gave them a sense of safety, making them believe they were untouchable. But the city had a way of turning, and even the strongest towers had foundations that could crumble. Every ally they thought was loyal might not be, and every shadow could hide a threat. As they celebrated their victories, the seeds of betrayal were quietly sown. Deals that once went smoothly now had unseen complications, and phone calls and meetings that seemed ordinary were being monitored. Unknown to Diamond and Jenard, the CBI had been watching them for months, collecting evidence, analyzing patterns, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. While the duo believed they were invincible, the world outside their empire was shifting. The organization that had once seemed powerless or uninterested was now preparing to move. Their empire, built on fear and respect, was about to face a challenge that money, influence, and violence could not easily overcome. Even as Diamond and Jenard planned their next moves, the city itself seemed to pulse with a new energy, a tension that no one could ignore. From the dark alleys to the flashy clubs, people were talking in hushed voices about the power players who had ruled for so long. Rumors of investigations, unexpected raids, and sudden disappearances were spreading faster than they could track. And yet, Diamond and Jenard moved forward, believing that the foundation they had built was unshakable. But the forces gathering against them were smarter, patient, and relentless. Tonight, their past triumphs would meet the harsh reality of betrayal, and nothing in their carefully constructed world could prepare them for the coming storm. The first cracks had appeared, unnoticed, but inevitable. The empire was strong, yes, but even the strongest walls can fall when the pressure from outside becomes too great. Diamond and Jenard were about to learn that every action has a reaction, and even the most untouchable can be touched when the right force moves at the right time. The CBI office was a stark contrast to the chaos of the streets. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off polished desks, and the quiet hum of computers filled the air, but beneath the surface, tension was thick and suffocating. Agents moved with purpose, yet a sense of unease lingered in every corner. For months, they had watched Diamond and Jenard from a distance, analyzing their every move, tracing their money, and mapping out their network of influence. The two men were brilliant in their ways of deception and manipulation, always staying just out of reach, always making it look effortless. But now, the evidence had grown to substantial, to undeniable. Files stacked high on desks contained records of illegal trades, connections to dangerous syndicates, and a trail of violence that could no longer be ignored. The leaders of the CBI had gathered, faces grim, eyes hardened by months of planning and moral conflict. It was no longer a question of whether to act, it was a matter of how, when, and with what precision. Inside the strategy room, a large digital map of the city displayed red and blue markers, each representing people, locations, or operations connected to Diamond and Jenard. The agents leaned over the table, their voices hushed but intense, discussing potential targets and weaknesses in the duo's empire. Every movement had to be calculated. One wrong step, one leaked piece of information, could send Diamond and Jenard scrambling and vanish into the shadows, leaving the CBI empty-handed. Debate raged on, not only about logistics but about the moral weight of what they were about to do. Diamond and Jenard were ruthless, yes, but they had supporters and pawns who could be caught in the crossfire. Balancing justice with collateral risk was delicate, and the tension in the room was palpable. Even the most seasoned agents found themselves questioning the timing of the operation. Acting too soon could alert the targets. Waiting too long could allow them to expand their grip even further. The decision to turn on Diamond and Jenard was not taken lightly. For years, there had been whispers of compromise. Rumors that some in the system were on their payroll, watching and reporting selectively. The CBI leadership had to ensure that this operation would not only succeed, but also be beyond reproach. Every angle was scrutinized. Surveillance footage was reviewed repeatedly, financial records were double-checked, and informants were re-interviewed. The agency needed absolute certainty that when they moved, there would be no escape. No chance for the two men to outsmart them. What made this mission even more dangerous was Diamond and Jenard's reputation for cunning and unpredictability. They were not just violent criminals, they were master manipulators, able to turn situations to their advantage with a single misstep by their opponents. The CBI knew that any hesitation could result in disaster outside the walls of the office. The city continued unaware, the streets moving at their usual rhythm. Cars honked, people laughed, and life went on as if the shadow war brewing above them did not exist. But the CBI was different now. They were no longer just observers. Plans were put into motion, contacts were discreetly warned or aligned, and surveillance was intensified. The tension was no longer a quiet hum. It was a living force, creeping through every communication line, through every hidden camera, through every agent's decision. Diamond and Jenard's empire, once untouchable, now had cracks forming in its foundation. Cracks that could collapse under the pressure if the CBI played their cards perfectly. In meetings, phrases like time-sensitive and critical window were repeated over and over, highlighting that the moment to strike had arrived. Every agent involved felt the weight of what was about to happen. The difference between success and failure could define careers, reputations, and lives even within the agency. Divisions began to show. Some argued for swift action, believing that Diamond and Jenard's arrogance would be their undoing. Others advised patience, suggesting that a prolonged observation could reveal even more about their operations, potentially exposing additional networks and allies. Arguments grew heated, but in the end, a unanimous consensus emerged: the CBI would act. It was no longer speculation, no longer a distant threat. The empire that had seemed invincible was about to encounter the force it had always underestimated. The agents moved with precise urgency, assembling equipment, finalizing strategies, and preparing to turn what had been months of observation into a decisive, unrelenting strike. Every phone call was logged, every meeting was encrypted, and every step was mapped with meticulous care. Outside, the night carried on, indifferent to the battle about to be waged within the shadows. And Diamond and Jenard remained blissfully unaware that the world protecting them had already begun to withdraw. Diamond and Jenard were in their element, surrounded by the luxury and chaos that their empire afforded them. From the outside, everything looked flawless: the sleek cars, the expensive clothes, the parties that seemed to pulse with energy and power. But beneath the glittering surface, there was a rhythm to their actions, a careful orchestration that only they understood. Diamond moved like a shadow in his office, analyzing numbers, reviewing contacts, and calculating every risk with cold precision. He had always been 3 steps ahead, a chess player playing against opponents who didn't even realize they were pieces on his board. Jenard, meanwhile, prowled the streets and warehouses, his presence a warning to anyone who dared cross them. He had the instinct to sense threats, the ability to read people in a glance, and the muscle to enforce their will when negotiation failed. Together, they were a perfect storm, and in their minds, nothing could touch them. They had been hearing whispers, rumors of movements in the city, small disruptions in operations, but dismissed them as minor irritations. After all, they had faced challenges before and had always come out on top. Every ally, every enforcer, every contact had been carefully chosen. And betrayal was a word that existed in theory, not in practice. Diamond and Jenard believed that the CBI, if it was even aware of them, could never mount a threat strong enough to challenge the empire they had built. That overconfidence became a shield, insulating them from suspicion, from paranoia, from the creeping tension that they could have felt if they paused to truly look. Nights were spent counting money, closing deals, and making plans to expand their reach further into areas they had only begun to control. The city was their Zor, so they believed. In private moments, however, cracks in their perception began to form, though neither would admit it. Diamond noticed that some communications were slower, some associates more cautious than usual. Jenard sensed a shift in the streets, subtle movements that suggested eyes were on them, tracking every step. Yet they shrugged these off, attributing them to coincidence or temporary lapses. The confidence they projected was both armor and blindfold, allowing them to operate freely while keeping real dangers at bay. They laughed at the idea that the CBI could interfere with them, convinced that law enforcement was reactive, slow, and always a step behind. But what they didn't realize was that patience and precision were now working against them. The same intelligence and ruthlessness they had admired in themselves had been matched, carefully mirrored by the agency that had silently observed every move for months. As the night deepened, Diamond and Jenard continued to plan, unaware of the web closing in around them. Deals were made with handshakes and nods. Warehouses were stocked and emptied with meticulous timing, and alliances were strengthened with promises of protection and shared profits. Every moment was a performance, a display of dominance and control that they had perfected over years. Yet in the shadows, movements were recorded, phones were tapped, and their patterns were analyzed with precision that even they could not match. The irony was stark. Their empire, built on intelligence and foresight, was about to be undone by forces they considered beneath their notice. The street lights outside cast long shadows into the offices and warehouses, almost like the unseen fingers of destiny stretching to touch them. Even as they celebrated victories and prepared for expansions, there were subtle signs of vulnerability. A warehouse left unattended for a few extra hours, a shipment that was unusually delayed, a conversation overheard in passing that hinted at a world outside their control. None of these moments seemed significant to Diamond and Jenard individually, but together, they formed the outline of a coming storm. The very strategies and cunning that had allowed them to dominate were now predictable, catalogued, and ready to be countered by those who had been silently waiting. And yet, in that moment, they were blind to it, focused on their empire and their power, oblivious to the fact that every step they took, every plan they made was being observed, measured, and prepared for a strike that could dismantle everything in an instant. Pride, confidence, and the illusion of invincibility had made them powerful, but it was also making them dangerously exposed. Diamond and Jenard had ruled the streets, controlled allies and enemies alike, and felt untouchable, but the hands of justice, silent and patient, were closing in. And the first move of the final game was about to be made. The moment came suddenly, but it had been months in the making. Diamond and Jenard were unaware that the web had already been spun, threads of surveillance stretching into every corner of their empire. The CBI, methodical and relentless, had chosen their moment with precision, waiting for the point where action would be most effective and escape least likely. It began with subtle moves: phone lines rerouted, financial transactions flagged, informants quietly repositioned, but quickly escalated into a coordinated strike that left no room for hesitation. Agents moved like shadows, silent and unseen, slipping into warehouses, following shipments, and documenting every face that had once served the duo without question. Each action was deliberate, calculated to cut off their allies before they even realized the trap was closing. Diamond and Jenard, confident in their power and untouchable in their pride, remained unaware that the walls around them were shifting, slowly tightening. As dawn approached, the first signs of disruption appeared. Deliveries were delayed inexplicably, trusted contacts missed scheduled meetings, and the streets that once responded to their commands with fear and respect now seemed hesitant, uneasy. Diamond, ever perceptive, noticed irregularities but interpreted them as minor inconveniences, trivial distractions that he could manage with a few calls and reassurances. Jenard, attuned to threats, felt a low-level tension in the air, the kind of instinctive unease that had always warned him before danger struck. Yet even together, their perception was insufficient. They could not see the extent of the network closing around them, nor could they predict the precision with which the CBI had coordinated the operation. The duo, accustomed to controlling every situation, now faced a force that operated beyond their influence. Then the strike became overt. Warehouses were raided simultaneously, cash and illegal goods confiscated, loyal associates detained or interrogated. Diamond and Jenard's carefully constructed empire, built on fear, money, and strategy, began to crumble piece by piece. Calls went unanswered, trusted lieutenants were missing, and the streets that had once bent to their will now echoed with uncertainty and caution. Every calculated move they made seemed to meet resistance they had not anticipated. The city itself felt different, as if the balance of power had shifted overnight. Diamond's mind raced, trying to map the chaos, to predict outcomes and devise countermeasures. Jenard's instinct took over, moving through the streets, confronting threats and demanding answers. But every attempt to regain control only revealed the depth of the betrayal. The CBI had cut off their lines of influence, isolated them from their network, and observed each desperate response with clinical precision. Panic began to seep into the edges of their confidence. Diamond, normally unshakable, found himself questioning every decision he had ever made, wondering if the empire they had built was already beyond saving. Jenard, normally calm and strategic, reacted with bursts of aggression, trying to force control over a situation that was no longer theirs to command. Every ally they reached out to either could not or would not help. Paralyzed by fear or already compromised, the empire of power and respect they had ruled with authority was slipping through their fingers, piece by piece, like sand in a storm. And yet, even in the face of the overwhelming pressure, neither of them fully comprehended the scale of the CBI's orchestration. The operation was not random. It was meticulous, and it had been designed to dismantle them completely without leaving room for escape. By the time the sun rose fully, Diamond and Jenard stood at the center of a crumbling empire. Streets that once obeyed their commands were silent. Warehouses that held their fortunes were empty. Phones that connected them to allies no longer worked. The realization hit slowly, painfully, that their control had been an illusion. The CBI had turned, and the force they had once underestimated had struck with precision, patience, and unyielding determination. The empire they had spent years building, the lives they had controlled, and the fear they had wielded now counted for nothing. Diamond and Jenard faced the stark truth. The streets they had ruled, the power they had commanded, and the invincibility they had believed in had all been shattered in a single coordinated blow. The betrayal was complete, and the game had changed. The duo, who had once seemed untouchable, now had to confront the reality that the storm they had ignored for too long had finally arrived, and survival would require everything they had and perhaps more than even they could muster.